maybe look at some of those next week. We are studying in the book of 1 Samuel. And I think I mentioned this maybe last week or recently. 1 Samuel and, 2 Samuel as well, and it really holds true on through Kings for the most part, but especially in 1 and 2 Samuel. It sometimes is difficult to find a stopping point. It just the action is just it's not necessarily chronological, and I think we mentioned that in the introduction. Sometimes things are out of chronological order, but it's just giving you one thing after the other as far as telling you what's going on in the history of David and the history of his life, the history of Samuel's life. It flows, and we've been in this section with our family Bible time for several nights, and every time we get, we especially with two little bitty ones now, it is hard to get them to sit still for too terribly long, and so we try to keep that brief, but at the same time cover two or three. We've got a little book that we use and cover two or three of those little sections, but I always find myself going, okay, where am I going to stop here? Because it's hard to find a good stopping point when you're in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. And so it is with our class. Sometimes we just have to leave off where we leave off. And that's kind of what happened last week. We were in chapter 2, toward the end of chapter 2. We were seeing this prophecy that God has made, and it will repeat again in this vision to Samuel in chapter 3 against Eli. He honored his sons more than God. How did he do that? By not restraining them. What'd you say, Jimmy? He didn't discipline. And we talked about this. There is the question of when do children stop being answerable to mom and dad. And in fact, even some of the folks that I looked at, notes from preaching school and things like that, some folks will even have things like you're responsible for your children regardless of their age. I don't think you can say that biblically because at some point, you think about it this way. At one point, I was under my parents' authority. I was responsible to them. And they brought me up. Eventually, I moved out. I was, almost 19 years old when I moved out. Was I still answerable to them? I think to some extent. I didn't think so. But I think biblically, yes, to some extent. But then, somewhere around 23, 24 years of age, I get engaged, and May 18th, 2002, I married Reagan. We moved off, and now we're a home. Sometimes people, say something like to a couple, especially to young couples, when are you going to start a family? If a man and woman are married, scripturally, biblically, that is a family. I just find it very difficult to say at that point I'm answerable to my parents. Now, it doesn't mean I should just, if my dad says, hey, son, listen to me, I think I need to give you some sound advice here, or, maybe even something that I might do that was unwise, might even get to the point of doing something that goes against the Bible, and say, listen, son, you don't need to do that, and maybe even get pretty stern. I think you still need to respect your parents is always a command. But especially, fast forward a year or two down the road, we have a son, Joshua. Well, now he's answerable to me. So that, even just when it's husband and wife, the husband is to be the head of the wife, the husband's to be the head of the household. So you see where I'm going with that. I just don't think you can make a case biblically that a child is always subject to his parents or to a parent or parents. You can definitely make the case you should always respect them. But I think what we see with Eli, and Robert mentioned this at the end of class last week, and I think it's worth mentioning, Well, Robert, I don't want to butcher what you said. Tell me that again. Yeah, this is not a children reaching 20, 25 years of age, or ever how old they were, and all of a sudden, man, they're rebellious, and Eli's not restraining them. This is something that happened over time. Children don't just wake up one day and they're rebellious. It happens over time. Now, sometimes there's something driving that. It might be a mood. It might be something going on in their lives, and that's where we as parents, we want to try to be involved and kind of peel back the layers and figure out what's going on here. But a child just doesn't become a hellion overnight. That's just not the way it works. It doesn't go that way. So this was a pattern in the sons of Eli in their lives. They're not being restrained by their father. He's not disciplining them. And what you'll notice, by the way, I don't know if, I don't think we pointed this out last week. Earlier in chapter 2, you know what Eli will do? He'll lecture, but he never really takes action, right? And sometimes there's a time for words, and sometimes there's a time for action. I heard one fellow say the Board of Education applied to the seat of knowledge. Sometimes that's what needs to happen. And sometimes it may not necessarily be in the form of corporal punishment, but sometimes it needs to go beyond just lecturing, right? There has to be corrective discipline from time to time. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah, not only did he fail to correct them, he allows them, Jimmy was pointing out, he allows them to fill a position they were absolutely unqualified for. And it affected beyond just Eli and his family, it affected the entire nation. And now you have people coming to try to worship God, to try to serve God, to try to carry out the sacrifices as God commanded them, and they can't, because here comes a priest that says, give me that flesh. Well, hold on, it's supposed to be after it's, no, I'm going to take it right now, and if you don't, I'm going to take it by force. And so, it affected beyond them. I think you were going to say something, Miss Tammy. Okay. Yeah, you got people that are grown, and modern day example is if you may, and I've known situations. I think we all know situations where parents, they discipline their children. They did what a parent should do. And of course, the difficulty for a parent is knowing when to lecture, when to take action, when to administer corporal punishment, when to administer maybe a timeout when they're little, grounding when they're older, whatever. It's difficult sometimes to know what action to take. But here are parents that they've brought their children up, they've disciplined, but then the child reaches adulthood, and it may be sometimes there are marital difficulties, sometimes there are difficulties with their own children now, and things like that sometimes cause a person to fall away. Well, what does a parent do? You can plead, and I've even known some parents that get pretty stern with their children and say, what you're doing is not right. And if you continue on this path, you're going to lose your soul. And you may very well cause your children to lose their soul because you've turned your back on the Lord. You're in the world, or in some cases, you're in a denomination, and you can't continue on this path and please God. And I mean, get pretty plain with them and stern. And the children just say, well, I appreciate Dad, but I'm going to live my life, you live yours. Something, to that effect. What do you do? Again, you got grown children. You can't just say, go to your room and wait for me there, and I'm going to figure out what I'm going to do with you. Well, they say, I'm leaving. You can't say, you're grounded. So common sense would tell us there has to be a point at which children are out from that authority of their parents. We're never out from God's authority, obviously, but out from the parents' authority, even though, again, there's still the obligation to respect our parents. And as parents, there's still an obligation to try to bring them back if they go astray. If they do something that is crazy. I guarantee you, to this day, I'm 40 years old. If I do something stupid, if I do something foolish, and especially if it's something that's going to bring embarrassment upon our family, the family name, or even just on my parents themselves, they'll let me know about it. Now they'll understand they can't force me to do what I'm supposed to do, but they'll tell me, and they'll tell me in no uncertain terms. And sometimes even within my own family, sometimes we'll just have a gathering with our immediate family and the cousins, and sometimes we just sit around and talk about something, and it might be my parents, it might be my sister, it might be me. And one of us will say, I don't think you're doing the right thing there. I don't think you handled that right. I don't think you're doing what you need to do there. So, but at the end of the day, they're adults. But yeah, Eli, he honored his sons above God because he doesn't restrain them. He'll lecture them, but he wouldn't take any kind of corrective measure. And so God says, you've put your sons above me. And again, as Jimmy pointed out, not only that, he put them into positions and allowed them to occupy positions that they never should have been in. And this just continues to go on. And so he says, God says there's going to be a changing of the priesthood. It's going to be taken from you, Eli. And it'll be validated, verse 34. Yes, it'll be validated. Here's the sign that you'll know this is a prophecy from God. Both of these boys are going to die in one day. So, chapter 3, I usually write down where I left off. I think we finished chapter 2, right? I just wanted to go back and mention that. Okay, that's what I was thinking. I usually put a mark, but I didn't have that. So, chapter 3. Samuel's ministering to the Lord before Eli. The word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. Some versions have the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Why was the word of the Lord rare in those days? Do what? Somebody said something. Probably. I mean, we're not told exactly why, but the most likely answer here, the obvious answer, seems to be because they're just not really concerned about following God. And so God, you seek the Lord and you will find him, right? Well, they're not seeking revelation from God. And so they're not getting it. Of course, they've got the law of Moses, but there were also, this was in a time when God would speak through direct visions and things like that, as we'll see with Samuel. But it was rare in those days, or precious, probably because, it's one of those, again, sometimes people speculate as to why that was. Some people speculate, well, they've got the law, so God didn't need to speak that way. Well, I suppose that's true, but he still did at other times during this dispensation of time. So why not at this particular moment? Well, again, the answer would seem to be obvious, that it's because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not following God. So, no open vision. Eli was laid down in his place. Verse 2 says his eyes are dim, that he cannot see. When the Bible in the King James says wax, his eyes began to wax dim. Wax means grow. Sometimes it'll say he waxed strong, or he waxed bold. Sometimes you'll see that in the book of Acts, but it just means grow. So his eyes began to grow dim, so he can't see very well. Ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Samuel's laid down to sleep. The Lord calls Samuel, of course. This refers to some kind of a lamp there that would be kept burning perpetually, as detailed when God gave the law of Moses, the law to Moses. But it says in I'm going to drop down to verse 7, Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. Well, he was too young at this point, it seems, to have developed a real relationship with God. But, and also we could say he's going to be a prophet, he's just not one yet. And this, of course, is his calling to be a prophet. Sometimes people today will talk about, in fact, one of the most frustrating things to me is when people will say to me, when they find out you're a preacher, and they'll say, oh, when were you called to preach? And I sometimes, I don't want to be ugly, I don't want to be snarky, but sometimes I'll say, oh, when I became a Christian, And they say, what? And sometimes people even say, wow, that's amazing. Right when you became a Christian, you were called to preach? And I say, yes, it's right there in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14. We're all called by the gospel. Every Christian is called to preach. Every Christian is called to evangelize. Every Christian is called to live the Christian life. There's no special calling to become a preacher. Sometimes people make that decision, and sometimes it's a decision that just got a thing recently from a young man, or actually he's a married man with family, but he's wanting to go to preaching school, and he's been deliberating over this for a while, he says in his little packet that he sent, and he's going to have to leave his job. That to go into preaching. And so he talks about how he's deliberated over this for a while and determined that this is what he wants to do, because he's got that fire in his bones we talk about with allusion to Jeremiah saying that he wasn't going to speak anymore about the Lord, but he had that fire in his bones that he could not hold back. But there's no special calling. With prophets in the Old Testament, there was. That's a whole different that last days he has spoken unto us by his Son, Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2. But I just, sometimes I struggle to point that out to people, because they want to know, when were you called to preach? And sometimes people have that idea, but that's not something that happens today. And that was something that God would do. When a guy was going to be a prophet, he would be called by the Lord. So, you know, you've probably read this before. God calls Samuel. He runs to Eli. Hey, what? Here I am. What do you need? Eli says, I didn't call you. So he goes back. It happens again. He goes back. It happens again. Eli is a little slow to figure this out. Reckon why Eli was so slow to figure this out? Could have been age. I think probably it goes back to verse 1. The word of the Lord was rare in those days, at least this direct revelation. So it probably was so rare that Eli doesn't, after 3 times, Eli goes, oh, wait a minute. That's the Lord calling you, Samuel. So the next time that happens, you just stay where you are and you say, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. And so that's, of course, what Samuel does. And God gives Samuel, picture here's Samuel. You've been dropped off at the temple or tabernacle as a young boy, and you're told, Mommy made a promise to God, and we keep our promises, so you're going to stay here and you're going to serve. I'm going to come visit you. I'm going to bring you code every year and all that she did for Samuel, but you're going to be here and you're going to serve God for the rest of your life. You've been lent to the Lord, as the King James puts it. And so, Eli's a stranger. Of course, he's going to become close to Samuel, no doubt. But then you develop a relationship with this man Eli, and you're becoming, you're learning the ropes, as we say. You hear this voice calling to you. You go in there, and the 3rd time Eli says, next time it happens, you say, speak, Lord, your servant hears. So he does, and now your first vision as a prophet. And what's your first vision? Or message, if you want to use that term. The downfall of Eli's household. I mean, picture poor old Samuel. And he wakes up the next morning, and Eli's got to be excited about this. The word of the Lord is precious in those days. It's rare. And so he gets up the next morning. Did it happen again? Yeah, it happened again. What? Did you do what I said? Yeah, I did that. Did God speak to you? Yeah, he did. He gave me a prophecy, gave me a message. Well, what is it? Can you imagine poor old Samuel? Well, it was just some stuff that's going to happen down the road. I could just picture Samuel maybe not wanting to tell him this. And so he says, to Eli's credit, he wants to hear it. In fact, God says, leading into this in verse 11, I will do a thing in Israel which both the ears of everyone that heareth it shall tingle. This is gonna burn your ears, so to speak. But he says, I'm going to perform against Eli all the things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. For I have told him, I'm in verse 13, that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. So Samuel lays there until the morning. He goes and opens the doors of the house of the Lord, as he no doubt always did. Samuel feared to show Eli the vision. I don't think he's afraid of Eli. I think he just, no doubt he was becoming close to this man, and you know, you just don't want to tell somebody something like that. That's not news that you want to go, and it's not, you know, ordinarily you'd be excited. I mean, here you are, you've been called to prophesy, you've been called to be a prophet for the Lord, you've received your first message. You'd think he'd be just jumping up and down, but due to the nature of that message, he didn't really want to. So Eli calls him, and what's the Lord said? And, you know, it seems here that Eli's figured out. This is, why is he not, you know, you receive your first vision and God's called you to be a prophet. Why would you not be, you know, bursting in to say, Eli, Eli, let me tell you what God has revealed to me. And so it seems he's picked up on it, because he says, I pray thee, hide it not from me. God do so to thee, and more also, if thou hide anything from me of all the things that he said unto thee. Don't hold back, boy. Tell me. Just tell me what he said. So Samuel told him and hid nothing from him, verse 18 says. And so Eli says, it is the Lord. Let him do what seemeth him good. So Samuel grew. The Lord was with him. Let none of his words fall to the ground. In other words, nothing that he said failed to happen, to come to pass. And all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. Brother Richard Curry used to say all the time in preaching school and Bible geography class, from Dan to Beersheba. He had that real deep voice, from Dan to Beersheba, and that was that meant from the north to the south. We would say in America, coast to coast, kind of the idea. So Dan to Beersheba is just a way of saying everybody everywhere knew Samuel was ordained a prophet from God. The Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So God has pronounced this judgment against Eli's household because of his failure to discipline his sons. There was something else I wanted to mention. Looking at verse 14, there's going to be no forgiveness for those who are involved. It's not because there can't be forgiveness, but particularly in the instance of, particularly referring to Eli's sons, no forgiveness. Not because they can't be forgiven, but because they don't seek it. There's no repentance involved. They have officially forfeited the priesthood. And Eli, the sad thing here is he contributed to that by failing to restrain them. And Eli, everything about Eli otherwise that we can see, he's a good man. But he didn't restrain his sons. And I mean, that is, you talk about a cautionary tale in Scripture, buddy, that's it. And we would do well to take it to heart and learn from it. But Eli accepts the word from the Lord. And so we need to be truthful like Samuel with God's word, even though someone we may fear, or there may be the reality that someone may want to shoot the messenger, as we say. But we still got to tell the word of God as it is, right? And also, like Samuel, we need to do what's right. Let the chips fall where they may. So nothing Samuel said failed to be fulfilled. Going on into chapter 4, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. So Samuel's coming into his own here as a judge, as a priest, and also, of course, as a prophet. So the Philistines, they're going to go out against the Philistines to battle. By the way, this is if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the flashcard questions. One of probably the major enemy of the Israelites in the days of Samuel, in the days of Saul, the king, and even on into the days of David, were the Philistines. I mean, you're just going to read over and over again about conflict with the Philistines. So that's, and of course, that all again goes back to they didn't drive out the inhabitants of the land. You know, we started talking about that when we first started this study of Hebrew history. They were told, drive them out. This was a judgment from God against them for their idolatry. And Israel, by and large, did not fulfill that. So they go against the Philistines. They pitch beside Ebenezer. This is a figure of speech, and I just went blank on the... Bob, I know you've studied hermeneutics. Do you remember what that is when you call something? It's not metonymy. It escapes me. It is. It's a figure of speech. Yeah, we'll just stick with that. But there's a word for this when you call something by, in other words, this place is called Ebenezer, but you're in the middle of the historical account that's going to tell you why it's called Ebenezer. Because Ebenezer means what? Does anybody remember this? The Lord has helped, I believe. Is that right? And now you got me forgetting it. It's buried in my notes somewhere, but I believe that's right. Yes, stone of help. The Lord has helped. So, why did they call it the Lord has helped? Well, that's what is beginning to be told, but it's giving us the name of the city, even though at this point in the history, in the narrative, it hasn't been named that. So it's a figure of speech that you'll see sometimes. You see this in the book of Genesis with Bethel, which before was called Luz. Jacob named it Bethel because he said this is the house of God, and that's what Bethel means, house of God. So when you sing the song, Here I Raise My Ebenezer, when you study 1 Samuel 4 and 5, you'll begin to understand that a little bit more, because if you're like me, when we used to sing that as a child, I thought, what does Scrooge and A Christmas Carol have to do with this church hymn that we're singing? But sometimes we sing songs without understanding, right? And I that's on me. I should have done the research earlier to understand that. But that account is here in this section. So they go and they're battling against the Philistines. And guess what happens? Israel is defeated. They're smitten before the Philistines. About 4,000 men. So the people come into the camp, verse 3 tells us, and they're kind of, well, why is the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Oh, I know what we need. We need the Ark of the Covenant. Somebody go get the Ark of the Covenant. And when that comes, then we'll have a victory. They thought that the Ark would save them rather than God saving them, because they were following Him. The problem is not that they didn't have the Ark. The problem is they didn't have God. And they didn't have God because they weren't following God faithfully. God never intended an object would inherently save the people. The ark just represented His presence among the people. They've turned it here into superstitious idolatry. Yes, sir. No. And you know, there are modern day examples abound. I think sometimes of athletes or maybe musicians that are some of the most vile and ungodly in their behavior, but they'll have that cross around their neck. And they may take it out and they're going to kiss that cross. And it's a superstitious idolatry. It's like, I can live however I want to, but I got this cross around my neck, so I'm claiming Jesus, and man, He's going to protect me and save me. No, it doesn't work that way. God, in fact, God hasn't even promised that to a faithful Christian. He hasn't promised that, you know, even by being a faithful Christian, there's nothing bad ever going to happen to me. He just promised us, you be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. But it happens even among members of the church sometimes. In fact, I've seen it sometimes. I used to get fired up when I was in the St. Louis area, because at that time the Rams were still in St. Louis. And we would sometimes have members of the church that would just skip the morning assembly. They'd be at the Rams game. Maybe a noon kickoff or whatever. They'd just skip the morning assembly. And they'd be there at the Rams game but you know what happens Sunday night? They're going to be there. You know why? Not because they're just overcome with guilt and contrition, because they just blatantly disregarded the assembling of the church and put that second to football, but because I missed the Lord's Supper. I got to take the Lord's Supper, and I'll be all right if I just go and take the Lord's Supper. Folks, that makes me so frustrated and just sometimes downright angry. That is not what the Lord's Supper is about. You just, especially you read 1 Corinthians 11, and Paul's pretty clear about that. You don't partake in a manner that is worthy. Not saying you're worthy of the Lord's Supper. None of us is worthy of the Lord's Supper. But you take in a worthy manner, examining yourself. He says if you don't do that, you're eating and drinking damnation to yourself. And what that means is if I just decide I'm not going to be there, if I just decide I'm skipping out, but I got to go and I got to take the Lord's Supper, that's eating and drinking damnation. There's no, in fact, I understand the concern, and I certainly wouldn't want to be a stumbling block to anybody, but there's no mandate in Scripture to have an evening Lord's Supper once. And if you missed it willfully, then there was a concern for your soul, and they would address that. If you missed it honestly because you couldn't be there, maybe it was work, maybe it was sickness, then you're under no obligation to take it. If you genuinely could not, that's okay. And in fact, you think about that, the whole point of communion is, well, communion, right? So sometimes members of the church, even today, misunderstand this, and they get this superstitious idolatry that I can live how I want, I can do what I want, I can, maybe be there for services, maybe not, but as long as I get that Lord's Supper in, I'm going to be all right. In fact, sometimes I've even dealt with this, sweet sisters and brothers in Christ that were shut in, that they couldn't get there for communion, and they're not saying, boy, I really wish I could have some folks come and sing gospel hymns with me, or I wish I could hear some preaching, or have some folks pray with me. No, they say, I got to have the Lord's Supper. And sometimes it's an honest misunderstanding. I understand that. But we need to make sure we don't have this idea of superstitious idolatry in the form of an Ark of the Covenant, or in the form of the Lord's Supper, or a cross hanging around your neck, or whatever it may be. That was Israel's problem. So they say, bring the ark. So guess what? They bring the ark. Here come Hophni and Phinehas. They were a part of this superstitious idolatry, it would seem. It seems pretty obvious. That's probably how they, live with themselves. Sometimes you read about somebody as hypocritical and just blatantly disregarding the word of the Lord like they did, and you think, how do you even stand that? How do you live with yourself to be in that role as a priest and to behave like that? Well, they probably just told themselves, well, the Ark of the Covenant, this superstitious idolatry, the same way many people live with it even today. But they bring the Ark of the Covenant. Man, the Israelites shout. They're excited. We're going to win the battle now. And guess what happens? Not only did they lose, the ark gets taken. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 7, the Philistines, they say, God is coming to the camp. I think most people would say that's probably better translated. You're dealing with Philistines here who are idolatrous. So it's very doubtful that they would say, oh, the God of heaven is coming to the camp. What they're saying here is probably more accurately translated, gods have come into the camp. And part of what makes me think that is because they basically say, oh, steel yourselves, let's fight. If they understood this to be the God, they would know, you can fight as hard as you want, you're going to lose if he's with his people. But they have the idea of gods. Sometimes gods could be overcome, and if our gods are against their gods and all these idolatrous gods, it's kind of a tug of war. But with the God of heaven, Jehovah, there is no tug of war. Puny mankind can't even stand before him unless God allows it. Yeah, it seems that they looked at that. In fact, when they take the ark, they are going to take it to their idolatrous house and set the ark right there with Dagon, which is Where's my notes about Dagon? I had some further notes. Of course, they come back. We'll come to that in just a moment. They come back and do what? 5-2. Okay. So I hadn't got there yet. So the Ark of the Covenant is taken. Hophni and Phinehas are slain, just like God said would happen. That was a sign that the prophecy was true. They come. They tell Eli. Eli's an old man now, and he's heavy. And when he asks what's going on, what's the deal with the tumult, he's 98 years old. He's blind basically, and he's a big man. But when they tell him that the Ark of the Covenant was taken and Hophni and Phinehas were slain, he fell from off the seat backward. It's interesting. He doesn't do this when he hears about his sons. He does this when he hears about the Ark. I don't know if there's any significance to that or not, but some people say that he's more concerned about the Ark than his sons. I don't know. It may just be the combination of news. But anyways, he falls off backwards. His neck breaks, and he dies. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, goes into premature labor at this stress, and she dies in childbirth, and she names her child Ichabod. You know, I've said it before, Hebrew names always have meaning. Ichabod means what? The glory is departed. Because why? Because the ark was taken. They think the world has come to an end because the ark has been taken. What they need to be doing is thinking, okay, we need to get ourselves right with God, and the ark wouldn't have been taken in the first place. But again, it's that mentality. So she says, the glory of God is departed, or the glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken. So they bring the ark, they bring it to Ashdod. This is one of the 5 chief Philistine cities. And they take the ark of God and bring it into the house of Dagon. They set it by Dagon. Dagon was this, I don't think I have it here, but probably most scholars believe was the chief Philistine god. This would be, what to them was a god of vegetation and grain. And it's said in their lore that Baal was often referred to as Dagon's son. But Dagon, I'm trying to remember all the details, you know, and some of this differs from source to source, but the torso and upper body was a fish. And that's the idea of fish and seafood and things like that, provision from the sea. But they bring the ark and set it in the house of Dagon. Now, you know, if you know anything about the God of heaven, you know this is not going to turn out well for Dagon. Because Dagon is no God. But they put him right there, side by side, with an idol. The Ark of the Covenant of Jehovah God. So they get up early in the morning. Dagon is falling on his face. You know what's happened here? Dagon bows before Jehovah. You talk about a message that should have hit hard and hit home very hard with these Philistines, but it didn't. So he's fallen upon his face, and not only that, the head of Dagon, the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Oh, sorry, this is the next day. They take Dagon the first day. I skipped verse 3, the rest of it. They take Dagon, they set him in his place again. So they say, that's strange, Dagon's fallen over. Set him back up. The next day, they come in, not only has Dagon fallen over, now his head, the palms of his hands are cut off. Just the stump is left. Again, what does it take to get to some people? Some people are just not going to listen. Not because they can't, they just won't. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod unto this day. Some people say this means that they actually shut down that idolatrous house. I don't know if that's what it means or if it just means some kind of a superstitious tradition.